question from the University UB from Mimi Depress, and this is a question for Duncan. The question has 2 points. The first point, Duncan, is how can you make sure the data collection is done in an accurate way at all universities, in the same way at all universities?
This is a continual difficulty for any organization that's gathering data. The first thing to say is that we are relying on universities to be honest, and fundamentally we believe that universities are trying to be honest. It would be a very sad day if we said that organizations whose job is to search out new truth were fundamentally lying. So we believe universities, but to help them, we try and be as clear as possible about our definitions. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, that rankings often measure things that are perhaps simpler than we would ideally like to. So for many metrics, we would like to have really sophisticated measures, but we need to work at the speed of the slowest. We need to acknowledge that a university in, I'm going to pick on the Al-Farabi Kazakh National University in Almaty, which is an excellent institution, but their entire institutional research team is half of a physics professor who was probably not in the room when they gave out the jobs. So the capacity for different institutions to gather this data is very, very different. So we have to try and make allowances for that. But it's about being as clear as possible on our side, and also checking against other sets of data where those data is available. But we have to acknowledge that that is very patchy in different parts of the world. Usually in Europe, there are other sources of data to support information, but in other parts of the world, that isn't always the case.
Thank you, Duncan. And also from the same participants, Mimi Depré from the Flemish-speaking Free University of Brussels, VUB, she's asking another question about gender. What are the methods to monitor improvement in gender and obtain a global cultural change?
So I think there are a couple of things here. The first one is the actual measures we look at. And you can go, I'll not go through those in detail. You can look in the methodology and see what those are. There are a couple, though, which are worth picking up on. One of which is around, because I think this is particularly relevant to the great research universities of Europe, which is we measure the percentage of women in senior positions. And one of the things that we see consistently is that the traditional research universities usually have a far worse position when it comes to this metric than younger universities do. Now, in fact, a couple of years ago, we did a teaching ranking in Europe, and this is one of the things we measured. And there was well, I'm going to pick on the United Kingdom here because we are responsible for so many wrongs in the world, we might as well add another one. There was an inverse correlation between the research performance of a university and the number of women in senior positions. And I think that's something that European universities need to look at as a whole. What more can they do? But I think there's another interesting thing that you touch on here, which is a weakness of some of the things we do, or some of the things we measure. Often when you look at measurement, whether it's for a ranking or indeed when you try and assess, for example, the performance of a charity, you end up measuring either inputs or outputs, because those are things that people find easy to measure. You can measure how many people come into your surgery, for example, if you're a doctor. What you need to move towards ideally is measuring outcomes. What difference does the work make? And I think that's one of the things that you were hinting at in your question. The difficulty is that outcomes are very, very challenging to measure in a consistent fashion. What I hope we'll see over time is that as we become more sophisticated, as universities become better at providing data, we will gradually move some of the things we measure away from being outputs towards being outcomes. The first thing, though, is are people actually delivering in terms of outputs? Once we know that, we'll move onwards.
Thank you, Duncan. And now we have another question from Yukino Mori from the Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. So we are very happy to have also participants from Canada online. And the question, I think, is more for Jonathan and Daniel. The question is, we are currently discussing best approaches for professionals in international offices at universities to connect out international activities to the SDGs. Can you share ideas on strategies universities can take in order to implement the SDG framework in ways that would advance our effort towards internationalization of our institutions? Who would like to start?
I'm happy to have a go at that, though I might duck the question partly because I think the question's slightly wrong and goes back to my presentation. I think it's not about the SDG framework per se, it's about what your purpose is as a university. And every university, you know, we have very similar purposes, but we have very different histories and very different legacies. And that influences how we articulate that purpose. So once you understand why internationalization is so important to your university, then I think you can start to think about how that will impact on the SDGs. And if you do that appropriately and everybody else does it appropriately, those impacts will be different. They won't be the same. I think that's really important. Just a footnote to that is one of the really interesting dynamics I think we're seeing with the COVID pandemic, especially in the sort of more developed countries of Canada, of Europe, of the US, is a realization that the dependency on high fee international students may not be a great strategy. And I think that is starting to generate a conversation, which I think you're hinting at in your question, is what do we actually mean by international students and internationalization? And if we move away from thinking of that as a financial strategy to a strategy around cultural competencies, a strategy about understanding other societies, that will be a massively positive outcome of this pandemic.
Thank you. And Danielle, would you like to react also to this?
Well, maybe just simply to mention that we found that the grid that provides the list of SDGs is something quite interesting to use. When you work with indicators, frequently you work on indicators of different research disciplines, areas, mathematics, physics, etc. But that puts you quite away from the real objectives of the what you want to make, to provide, to find as a result, etc. What is interesting with the grid of readings that provide the SDGs is that, well, you have really goals in front of you, and you can decide, well, what we have done, for instance, in PSL was choosing a limited number of goals we found quite consistent with our own experience, but it's really a change of perspective, which I found quite fruitful.
Thank you. And there is another question in the chat for you, Duncan, from Damiano Pinnacchio from the University Tor Vergata in Rome, Italy. And you can read it there, I think, but the question is, did you measure the impact of SDGs university actions in line with their ranking?
So the goal of the measures is to try and understand what universities are already doing. So at least that's the first goal. One of the things that we've believed for a long time at Times Higher Education is that universities, oddly, are not always very good at publicising what they're doing. I think this is particularly true for researchers. So a lot of researchers have a tradition of saying, I do my research, I publish the paper, and the paper speaks for itself. Well, that might have been the case back in the 1700s, but frankly nowadays, with over, I think it's 8.8 million publishing academics within Scopus, getting what you're doing out there, making it visible, is a challenge. And that's in an area where people are publishing. There's a lot of work that universities are doing which isn't necessarily about publishing papers. It's about the work you do in your community. It's about the work that you do through your students, the volunteering that was talked about earlier. And when we think about some of the issues that Jonathan raised, this idea of place and a university's location within its community, then being able to talk to that community, being able to explain to the community the work that you're doing is vitally important. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done there for universities to be better at communicating what it is they're already doing. But the second and slightly, well, not very well hidden, so I say this as if it's a top secret thing that I'm about to divulge, so don't tell anyone else, but obviously one of the things we were hoping to do with this particular ranking is to encourage more universities to actively progress against the SDGs. There is no doubt, and let me be clear, there are quite rightly criticisms of rankings. Rankings can be used in ways that are inappropriate. They can measure things that are complete rubbish. And as a result, they can have negative consequences. But what they do gain is a lot of visibility. And we've heard from Jonathan that sometimes with senior university leadership, the visibility is something that they crave. If we can encourage university to see delivery on the SDGs, delivery on sustainability is another way that they can get visibility, then maybe that can help universities to coordinate internally, because again, one of the things we've discovered is that although some universities have clear focus and have clear people with responsibility, in many universities this work is distributed. It's not worse because it's distributed, but it's not always centralized. And my personal opinion is that gathering data in one place, when that place is the president or the vice chancellor or the rector's office, means that strategic decisions will be made based on that data. If that data is distributed, you're less likely to see it become a strategic goal of the university. So in the long run, I'm sorry this is a fairly long-winded and perhaps not precise answer to your question. In the long run, I hope that actually we can play a small part in supporting universities in becoming better focused on sustainability than they were in the past.
Thank you, Duncan. And I do have a question for Sebastian, because sometimes I think we forget that one of the goals is goal 17, partnership for the goals. And this is, I think, is very important in consideration of what ESU and other student organizations are doing. So the question for Sebastian, how can we better partner with the students? Because in the end, universities are there because we care about students and their future. And how can we work together better, in this case for the SDGs, but also for other purposes? Sebastian, I think we lost Sebastian.
Connection was failing a bit.
Okay, so you're there. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Did you manage?
I didn't hear the last bit of the question.
I will repeat. No, just I wanted to mention this goal. One of the SDGs is partnership for the goals, number 17. And in this case, I wanted to ask you, how can we partner better with students, with ESU and other student organizations to actually be more efficient in the achievement of the SDGs?
Thank you. I think that's a very relevant question. I do think that many students' unions, also on the local level, really have this at the heart of their political priorities. Whenever students want to organize, mostly there is not too much money involved. Mostly there are not too many spaces involved that they can use. So I think one of the go-to points is giving that space to use to students, to organizing students, to provide them with spaces, to provide them with support. For them to organize themselves. I think that there are, in times of COVID, we see that a bit more, that there are many extremely knowledgeable, intelligent people out there that know a lot about this. And even the fact that the Students' Union started to organize more webinars because it's just easier and you don't need that much money, you don't need the spaces to get these people in to talk about these issues is something that helps out, like giving knowledge, supporting. I think on the other side, this whole thing that we were talking about when it comes to mainstreaming sustainability education within curricula, within universities, that's something extremely important. And on the other side, we have many projects running with universities that want to engage in making their own structures more sustainable or European projects more sustainable. So funding opportunities are another important point where students and educational institutions can partner up to work on this together. I think the outreach needs to come from both sides. So students need to approach institutions, but on the other side, if institutions approach organized students, that usually is the best way to start an engagement and to work in this regard.
Thank you very much. Other comments maybe from the panelists or questions? Yes, please, Jonathan.
Yeah, so I wholly agree with that, but I also think that's where the book New Power is really exciting, because actually we're starting to see a new type of activism, which is, as I mentioned, this merging of social movements, which is not new, but combining that with the sort of the information age. And we've got a new generation of young people who are coming through, who have a very distinct set of values and a very distinctive skill set in being able to mobilize individuals through social media. And things like Extinction Rebellion are a very clear articulation of that, but it's not just at the national, international level, it is very local. And the various sort of student activism I've sort of had to sort of engage with when I was a vice president, it is very, very clear how effective and influential that is. And actually, Sebastian mentioned the word support, and one of the things I would love to do is to actually develop modules about effective student activism and how you articulate these new power concepts to this new generation of students, because actually that is how we're going to navigate ourselves out of this in-between time. But to do that, universities, especially universities like King's, have to give up a lot of power, and that's not necessarily easy.
And I think there's also a potential for student activism even earlier. So one of the things that makes, I think, the new information age even more exciting from this perspective is that, you know, I had to wait till I got to university to join the Students' Union and to participate in this. But by that time, one of the main levers I had on the university had gone, and that is my choice of university. And I think we'll increasingly see university students or prospective university students using that power in the decisions they make. And for most universities, whether it's directly because of the financial aspect or in parts of the world where it's not necessarily directly about the finance, where it's about getting the best students, then that is another area where activism and awareness of students could be really powerful.
Thank you. Other comments on this? One point I wanted to ask Ramu. You mentioned some very relevant historical elements, you know, like the famine in Ireland in the 19th centuries and many others. If we look back in the history of Europe and in many other areas of the world which are very wealthy nowadays, we see, many examples of how much we suffered. And it is, in my opinion, really very sad to see that we forgot very easily most of that. And I think Jonathan in his presentation mentioned the populism, mentioned, you know, what happened recently in our societies. I would say before COVID, many topics which now completely disappeared were in the news every day, including, for instance, migration, to Europe. Europe was invaded by, a number of migrants, which in the end, from the scientific point of view, was very low, but the perception of the people was really very, very high. So the question in general, how can we make sure that our societies are more aware of our history, of what happened before, and would commit more for SDGs, which at the moment are a little bit neglected, like also Duncan showed. Many universities do not even commit, on the SDGs, poverty or hunger or other points, because maybe people felt that they were not very, very relevant for their institutions. How can we improve this situation?
Thank you, Luciano. That's a very pertinent point, and I've really been, as I knew I would be, completely enlightened by the discussion we've had this afternoon or this morning. Two things. One is that if you go back to the UN Charter, I think, which is 75 years old this year, I think its most critical phrase, and it's a phrase vital to the SDGs, is the dignity and worth of the human person. And what happens in a situation like the famine, or in the situation like a world war, or in the situation of a pandemic, is that dignity and worth is completely diminished because people really are reduced to statistics and are not given either the care or the respect or the long-term investment that a human being demands. And flowing from that, I think one of the most critical elements of the SDGs, which is often overlooked, is in goal and target, I think 4.7, where there is a reference to global citizenship. And it's a bit of a Pollyannish term, and I know that people have problems accepting it or even defining it. But if I can go to your specialty, Luciano, if I may, you specialized in oxidative stress, in free radicals, right? Now, what does this mean? This means you have an atom. That atom is protected by a shell of electrons. If that shell is lacking, if that shell is broken, then the atom tries to find protection from elsewhere and invades other cells to be able to augment its supply. So that is, to my mind, what is happening in our world of today. It's what happened during the famines. It is what happened, as Duncan did graciously say, in Europe's predation of the rest of the world in the 19th and 20th centuries. So if you do not have that outer shell of the Sustainable Development Goals protecting each one of us, then each cell, each human being will relate to another human being, not in the context of a common global citizenship, but in the sense of a desperate predator, wanting to get from that other human being, from that other entity, the necessity to herself or himself survive. And to my mind, that is the greatest logic of the SDGs. They allow us to create that shell around ourselves, which is protective, but it is not a shell that insulates or disables us from reaching out to other entities, be they human, be they national, or certainly be they global.
Thank you, Ramo. And a similar question to Sebastian. I know students in Europe focused a lot on SDG 13, climate change. They committed, they actually demonstrated in the streets on this Fridays for Future, etc. But again, before COVID, for instance, health was a little bit not in, I think, in the radar of students or universities. And other SDGs, if we take as just an example, for instance, number 16, peace inequalities, or number 10, reduce inequalities. So peace and justice is 16, and reduce inequalities number 10. So again, how can we encourage students also to be more aware of what happens not only in our societies but around the world, to commit and try to also make the world a better place for ethical reasons, first of all, in my opinion, but also because in a globalized world, we see now with COVID, but with many other phenomena, that any problem that is there in the world in a way will also affect our societies sooner or later.
That's a very big question, but I will try to answer. I agree that I think that through COVID, the sense of living in a global world for many increased, in the sense of that everybody knew there was something in China, and a few months later we live in this reality. And I think it also increased the sense of many young people and students specifically about the fact that having a functioning health system, having a functioning social state shall never be taken for granted, and these are investments in the benefit of all of us. As you also said, the students movement and youth engaged with sustainability usually puts the focus on 13, usually puts the focus on climate change, and I do think that through this movement that really felt an uprising in the very last years, it's not have been that long, is a transitional channel that can get us to a point where we are being more aware that there is way more issues than just climate change and then just COVID in this world. And I think the SDGs are a very good instrument, a very good tool to do that. But I think when it comes to sensibility and making people aware, we should not only focus on higher education. This is something that has to start all the way back in early childhood education, needs to go through all levels of education in order to get people aware of these issues. And I think if this, how do you say, if this push that we got now is being continued in a smart way, especially through online activism, especially for people informing themselves on social media and on the internet about hopefully not fake news, but the things that really matter, it can be a transition together with educational efforts to make people aware that we all sit in the same boat and we all face the same problems in the end.
So thank you, Sebastian. There is another question in the chat to all panelists. I just received it just now. Still difficult how to measure real impact of efforts at universities, direct, indirect, short, long term, and avoid the pitfall of cherry picking.
I'm happy to take that on. I can see who's asked it as well. So it's a very legitimate question in any assessment of impact in any field, and there is no simple answer and there is no golden bullet to that question. I think it comes down to the rigor of the evaluators and the transparency of the evaluators, and the sort of openness to be challenged and tested on both that transparency and rigor. It is good research methodology, frankly, which answers that. But I think there has been in the past, by which I mean today, very good examples of, or very bad examples of cherry picking. And I think universities, especially when it comes to research agendas and research funders, when it comes to research agendas, have been very skilled at picking the sort of development of X or the development of Y. We'll see if we ever get a vaccine for COVID, we're going to see the whole of every R&D budget for the next 50 years justified on the back of that that vaccine. And the real intellectual question is actually, what's the tail look like? What about all that research funding that led to nothing? And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, because maybe we have to do that to find those cherries. But when we evaluate research and we evaluate universities' impact, we've got to really understand what the denominator is as well as the numerator. And there are times we just focus on the numerator. But I do think that that those aren't new issues, but they're issues that require honesty in highlighting when doing any form of impact assessment.
Yeah, and to follow that up, yeah, I don't think, well, put it another way, if anyone who produces a ranking tells you that it is the only ranking and it is the only truth, then run a mile. We're trying to be honest about this. We recognize there are huge drawbacks in the approach we've taken. We think it's the best one we could have taken, but nevertheless, there are always going to be challenges. I think one of the things we've put in which tries to reduce this cherry picking is the idea of giving extra credit for public information. Now, it doesn't guarantee that people aren't going to cherry pick, but when a university says this is what we're doing and they showcase something, if it turns out to be something they're not doing, and the most obvious example, if we look at SDG 11, I think it's SDG 11, yes. One of the things we asked there is about public access to university resources such as libraries, etc. If you say, yes, we allow the public access, you put on your website the opening times and people can't actually get into your buildings at those times, then you will be challenged on that by people banging on your door, which is a very rapid feedback loop. So we've tried to do that way because we think that actually that helps make cherry picking less likely, but it doesn't stop it entirely. You may have situations, for example, where you have a university that is doing brilliant work in one place and doing terrible work in another place. It's very hard for us to recognize that. It's a very difficult thing to spot, particularly given the size of institutions. But we come back again to this idea that we're trusting universities to be, at the core, honest about what they're doing. And if we can't trust them at that level, then I think there are bigger problems than a simple ranking.
Thank you,
I'd
Duncan.
also like to suggest, if I may, Luciano, and this is an idea which I don't know, Duncan, whether you've factored this in. At some point, now that you've taken the rankings to the SDGs, would governments be a resource for the information that you use for the rankings? Would you go to a government saying, what have you done in terms of specific policies relating to the SDGs, which have derived from academic research? And that would, I think, give a wholly new dimension.
It would. Now, we do ask that the other way around. So in SDG 16, for example, is the most obvious one because of its close link with strong institutions. We ask about the degree to which universities are working with governments. The difficulty with doing it the other way around is that different governments have very different approaches to how they recognise university participation. Some are very open. They'll invite, for example, Jonathan to talk to the Select Committee on Globalisation at the House of Commons, and that's all public record. Other countries have very different approaches. China, for example, that's not the way that the Chinese system works. You wouldn't be able to see very easily how universities were submitting or participating. And as I said before, this irritating aspect of rankings is this lowest common denominator. We need something that universities in different parts of the world could fairly present evidence for.
Thank you. And now I see a question again from Yukino Mori from Vancouver, but I apologize, we are running out of time. And I have a final, I would say, very general question for Duncan for the future, let's say. I mean, you mentioned, of course, that it's not easy to, organize these rankings and measure, I mean, the reality. I mean, to take a picture, I would say, of the what a university is doing. Universities are very complex institutions. We do very often things that do not easily emerge in the surveys, etc. And you mentioned also the limit, for instance, of measuring what in some fields is done, like in the humanities, in the social sciences, etc. Very often, things are maybe published in journals maybe that are not easily measured, etc. So the idea is, I'm sure you are looking at the methodology that you use until now, and which can you anticipate anything, or can you share with us which is your view about the methodology and how you're planning to improve the methodology to make sure that really the rankings will be very objective? And this is one point. And another point also, if you can also mention if you have any strategy to try to encourage more universities to participate. As I said, I think I fully agree that, of course, rankings are controversial exercises, but it is useful to participate. From our side, we will try to encourage Unica University to participate. And if you can share also if you have other strategies to promote this ranking.
So thank you very much, Luciano, for that. Yes, we're trying to make participation as widely as possible. One of the key things we are doing in next years is explicitly allowing postgraduate only institutions to participate. So we've changed a few of the definitions to make it clear that that's okay. Universities that are postgraduate only have a perfectly legitimate place to play in terms of sustainability. But unlike some of our other rankings, so the World University Rankings, for example, are limited to research-intensive universities. Conceptually, any higher education institution could participate in the impact rankings, and I think that's very important. So there's obviously going to be a focus there, particularly on trying to encourage universities from parts of the world where participation and visibility hasn't been high in the past. So generally speaking, if you think about that chart I showed, the map, well, what are we looking at? Sub-Saharan Africa, absolutely clear that the universities of Africa need to be able to demonstrate on a world stage the great work they're doing, because they are doing some really good work. Universities in India, again, there are a lot of work going on there that simply isn't visible on the world stage and needs to be. Latin America would be another area, and some of the ASEAN nations. So that's one aspect of it. In terms of how we plan to change in the future, well, there's a kind of practical side of it. One of which is that as we get feedback from universities, particularly about whether or not questions make sense in their context, Because I said at the beginning, I'm a tall white guy. I bring my privileges with me, unfortunately. I have certain perspectives on things. It's really useful if you see a question and it does not make sense to you, then please talk to us about it, and we will either try and work out how to make the question make sense, or if we can't do that, we'll try and think of a better question that actually is more global in terms of interpretation. There are other questions I hope we can change because everyone starts saying yes. So at the moment, one of the questions we ask is, do you recognise the Students' Union? Okay, I think we're probably the only ranking in the world that actually has that question there. And I should say, as an ex-student unionist, I was really keen on having that there. When we get to the stage where everyone says yes, great, we'll stop asking that question and we'll try and ask a question which goes into more detail about what that representation really means. For example, as Sebastian said, does it actually mean giving space for self-organisation of that union, or is it basically the state-approved students' union that has to do whatever the university tells it? Does the university students' union have representation in the highest aspects of decision making in the university, and so on? So that's the second way that things will change. But then there's the mechanism about how we're going to do that. Up till now, this has largely been down to internal processes within Times Higher Education. What I've got agreement from our board is that we will create an advisory group, and the advisory group will be there to act as critical friends to help us oversee the future development of the rankings. And that's really important to us, that this is an independent body. They will be free to question us on anything. So if they think we're addressing the wrong things, great. They can tell us that and we will have to take that on board. If they want us to go deeper into some areas, again, that will be something that they're totally free to do. And we'll start recruiting for that later on in the autumn, and then hopefully be able to announce who the people are on it at the launch of next year's ranking. One thing that's going to be crucial as part of that, obviously, though, is making sure that that is a truly diverse body. It has to be diverse in terms of geography, in terms of type of institution. And I think I would also like to see representation from users of the rankings as well. And I think in this case, I'm talking particularly about students and prospective students. So I will be reaching out to you, Sebastian, shortly to ask for ESU support on that. But I think that's a really positive way that we can take this forward and make the whole process both more transparent and also more independent in the future.
Perfect. So thank you very much, Duncan, for this final, replies. It's 5:02, so the time actually is finished. Unfortunately, I would like to thank very much all of you speakers for these excellent presentations. Very interesting discussion. I would like to thank very much the participants.